or the president without getting tested. So I went down there yesterday for a certain period of time, and I got tested. So, I mean, you get tested in order to make sure that you protect the president. For the obvious reasons. He's the president of the United States. It's extremely important that he stays protected.
Let's turn to the return to school, which is obviously on the mind of lots of parents and teachers and children across the country. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos and the president have insisted that schools across the country need to reopen. Have you spoken to them about your recommendations and your concerns about every school taking all children in for in-person learning, even if the virus is still spreading out of control?
Jake, I have not specifically spoken to the president or to Secretary DeVos about that, but we have discussed this in the presence of the vice president at the coronavirus task force meetings, because this is obviously a very important problem. You know, in general, when I think about that, I want to take a 40,000-foot look and say, as a fundamental principle, I do agree that we should try as best as we possibly can to get the children back to school, because of the well-documented, secondary, downstream ripple effects that are negative, particularly on parents and on the children when you keep them out of school. So if you at least agree that the general principle is to try as best as you can to get the children back to school, I think you have to put that in the context that an important issue in that is to make sure you do whatever you can to safeguard the safety and the health of the children as well as the teachers. And that should guide your policy.
See, as a father, if I could just say, I would be delighted to send my kids back to school. I mean, remote learning is horrible, especially for younger kids. It's just not the way that kids are supposed to learn. But obviously, I also don't want to risk their lives or risk them picking up an infectious disease that spreads to me and my wife or their grandparents, et cetera. And this is where I come down. I don't understand why, if it's so important to our federal leadership that kids go back to school, and I agree with the principle, as you just said you do, why we don't have testing up to speed so that the day before school, kids can all get tested, teachers can all get tested, anybody who else, administrators and custodians can all get tested, and then there can be tests at the school every 2 weeks or so, with obviously everybody washing their hands, wearing masks, et cetera. I would feel much more comfortable. And yet what I'm hearing from the federal leadership is go back to school, and nothing along the lines of, and here's how we're going to protect your children.
Well, there are so many different models of that. And I think what's being discussed now, Jake, is different types of approaches to do what I just said, to adhere to the principle of getting the children back to school, but in order to safeguard them, their health and their welfare, as well as the teachers, to do some sort of modeling that are different versions. And I've heard different versions from different principals and different superintendents about the school scheduling, about morning, afternoon, about alternate days, about more outdoor than indoor if you possibly can, protecting the vulnerable, but also what you're talking about testing, although I haven't heard it discussed in detail about elementary or middle school. Clearly, many of the universities are talking about the same model that you're talking about, that are more universal testing before you get in, and intermittent at different intervals surveillance testing. That clearly is being discussed at the level of universities and colleges. Whether or not that is even going to be discussed with regard to elementary and middle and other schools, I'm not sure.
The U.S. Surgeon General today, Dr. Jerome Adams, said that the U.S. needs to lower the transmission rate to get schools reopened. I want to play for you something I heard from Missouri's Republican Governor Mike Parson. This is what he had to say this week about students returning to school in the fall.
These kids have got to get back to school. They're at the lowest risk possible. And if they do get COVID-19, which they will, and they will when they go to school, they're not going to the hospitals. They're not going to have to sit in doctor's office for days. They're going to go home, and they're going to get over it.
I mean, just to repeat it, the governor said the kids who get it, he said they will get it. They're not going to have to sit in doctor's office. They're not going to hospitals. They're going to go home, and they're going to get over it. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, in general, children who get infected, as we know from the statistics, clearly, for the most part, do very well and don't get seriously ill. If you look at the rate of hospitalizations, it's much, much, much lower with children. But there are exceptions to that. And I think we have to be realistic to realize that children who get infected, for the most part, don't get serious illness. But some children do get seriously ill, and some do pass it on to the adults. So I think we have to be careful when we talk about that.
Finally, sir, I know you're a huge Nationals fan. I've seen you wear a Nationals mask at hearings. You're going to throw out the first pitch when the Nationals face off against the Yankees on opening day Thursday. Obviously, that's quite an honor. How are you going to do it in a way that conveys that we're not going back to normal, that this is baseball during a time of a pandemic?
Well, Jake, I think the atmosphere in which it's going to be occurring is going to speak that very, very clearly. There's not going to be people in the stands. It's just going to be televised. So I think that in and of itself tells you something about the stark difference between what we're doing right now and what we were able to do last year at this time.
All right. I hope you've practiced. That plate is a lot farther than you think it is.
Yeah, I used to play baseball as a young boy and as a kid in school, and I hope I don't bounce it too much.
Well, if you do, you'll be forgiven. I know you've been busy. Dr. Anthony Fauci, thanks so much for being so generous with your time and expertise today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Jake.
The CDC today says that the number of people infected in this country could be up to 24 times what's been reported. Our Dr. Sanjay Gupta is going to join me to discuss that and more next. Plus, Senate Republicans trying to put together a new $1 trillion stimulus deal, but there's just one big problem, and it's not Democrats. What is it? Stay with us.
A tincture of CBD costs over $100.
News team with him for a photo opportunity. They left the graffiti on the building, on the federal courthouse for weeks. They could have cleaned it off several weeks ago. This is all about politics. It's about political theater. It's clearly not about public safety nor about problem solving.
That was the governor of Oregon calling it like she sees it and calling out the politics she sees at play as unidentified federal agents continue to use force against mostly peaceful protesters on the streets of Portland, Oregon. They've used tear gas against the demonstrators and have reportedly even grabbed some off the streets, driving away in unmarked vans. Oregon Senator Jeff Merkley tweeted that he's frightened of what he's seeing, writing this, quote, "The warning signs of Trump's authoritarianism have always been there, and what he's doing in Portland now should terrify every American. We cannot, under any circumstance, allow him to normalize secret police in our streets. Not now, not ever." Claire's back with us. Claire, I know you were on the Homeland Security Committee in the Senate. What can Congress do? I mean, Frank Figliuzzi sort of pointed me toward the authority that Bill Barr and the president are using to even be there. But are there legal questions in your mind?
Well, of course there are. People need to, most Americans haven't spent a lot of time understanding the difference between federal and state jurisdiction when it comes to criminal activity. Just remember this, the FBI doesn't answer 911 calls. Over 95% of the crime prosecuted in this country, it's prosecuted by state prosecutors, not federal. Federal has a very limited jurisdiction. So what this lobbyist and former Hill staffer who has no experience with the military or with police or any training in this, what this acting DHS director is saying is there's a federal building in Portland. Therefore, we have jurisdiction to go protect that federal building. Well, can you imagine? That gives them jurisdiction to come in, take over the streets in every city in America where there's any federal facility. It's nonsense. They're not going to prosecute graffiti cases. They're not going to prosecute a small fire burning in a trash bin. And they're not helping, Nicole. They are making it worse. which is what I think the president wants to do, because I think he wants to try to, find footage that makes it look like lawlessness is the rule of the day. I have family in Portland. They say the vast majority of these protesters are peaceful. They have been peaceful for weeks. There are a few bad actors, but you take them out with surgical skill, not with a 2x4.
Well, and you take them out with local authorities. My question about legal authority is, how are we just covering these live pictures night after night after night? Why isn't there an immediate legal process for there to be a judge to say, until we're clear on the law and lines of authority and communicating? I imagine it's not safe for law enforcement at the federal or state level not to be communicating with one another. How is this happening night after night?
Well, I think there are lawsuits that have now been filed. I know the ACLU has filed a lawsuit about the way that they have grabbed up people off the street. I did see today that the Secretary of Defense gave some indication that he was not happy with the idea that these folks are wearing camo. Think about that. What are they doing in camo?
Crazy.
That is military. We don't use our military against American citizens. We don't do that. There should be only police uniforms. Every police uniform should have a name tag on it. And they should be surgically removing the bad actors who come out at night and talking to the peaceful protesters. Because you know what? Those peaceful protesters will help them do their jobs in terms of keeping it safe. But there's no need for, and by the way, where are all these CPB officers coming from? These are Custom and Border Patrol agents are supposed to be on the border. Where are they? Where are they coming from?
I guess now that we're not allowed to go anywhere, they had some free agents. Claire McCaskill, can you please come back? Can we stay on this? This seems like one of these stories that you look at the pictures and you can't believe this is happening here.
It's true.
Thank you for sticking around and having this conversation with us. It's really important. After the break, foreign interference in our election, round 2. New warnings today from Congressman Adam Schiff, with barely 100 days left to go until Election Day.
Wayfair has everything outdoor. From grill.
Will not be the last or the worst pandemic that we will face. Jake?
Okay. A little optimism followed by something else. Nick Watt, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
I want to bring in CNN Chief Medical Correspondent Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Sanjay, we just heard from the nation's top infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, in the previous block. He described testing in the U.S. as patchy and not as uniform as he would like. He avoided saying so, and I understand why. He has a job, and he feels that he needs to stay on that job, and I think a lot of people want him to. But what will it take to improve the number of tests, the lag in testing, and the lack of contact tracing?
Well, I think there's a fundamental problem here, which is that there's just so much widespread virus in this country because we ignored it for so long. It's very hard to catch up with testing. So on one hand, you can say we're doing more testing, than any other country in the world. Second thing you'd have to say is we need to do that much testing, and we're still missing, only catching maybe 10% of the active infections out there. So a lot of people are spreading, having no idea that they actually have it. That's because of lack of testing. And obviously, you can't even start to talk about contact tracing until you can bring the numbers down. The numbers are just too high. We got to bring down the viral load, Jake. If people wore masks and did all these physical distancing measures diligently, as we've been talking about since March, for a few weeks, the numbers would come down, and I think you'd be able to get your hands around testing.
As Dr. Fauci said today, masks, physical distancing, don't go inside to events unless you need to, wash your hands many times a day. So there are not going to be any medical experts at the White House briefing today. We're not even sure if it's going to be a briefing, but President Trump is holding some sort of event. Is it a mistake to not invite Dr. Fauci and other health experts to be there?
It's a complete mistake, Jake. No question. I got calls today from sources and colleagues from around the world. As I touch base with them regularly. They reach out to Dr. Fauci. They reach out to members of the coronavirus task force for their own guidance. And it seems to me at times we're not reaching out within the United States to the people who are, part of our own task force. It's a total mistake. Two big things. One is that it would be nice to hear about a path forward now from people like Dr. Fauci and Ambassador Birx. Two is, unfortunately, Jake, as we well know, a lot of things that are said by the president are wrong. And you need someone to fact check these things because sometimes they can be dangerous, some of the stuff that he's saying. So these things need to be fact checked real time. And it worries me that these scientists won't be there to do that.
Yeah, it was a couple months ago, or it was in April of April 26 or something like that, when President Trump mused publicly about ingesting disinfectants. Sanjay, today representatives from the top drug makers working on a COVID-19 vaccine, Nick Watt just talked about them, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, Pfizer. They spoke before the House Energy and Commerce Committee. There was concern expressed that President Trump might pressure these companies to release a vaccine before the vaccine is ready for election reasons. Take a listen.
Are your companies insulted by an accusation that you could bring a drug to market that's not safe or effective? Is that insulting?
Despite the speed that we're working at, we're neither cutting corners and regulators are not lowering their standards.
We stand by our science, and we will continue to develop safe and effective products as we always have.
So again, Dr. Fauci just said that you shouldn't wait. When the vaccine's ready, you should take it because that means that it's been approved. It's okay. What do you say to skeptics, and some of them are Democrats on Capitol Hill, who are worried that President Trump is pushing a vaccine to be issued before it's ready and it might not be safe, and he wants to do this to help his own reelection chances? What would you say to that?
Well, I think what you heard the pharma exec say is exactly what you'd expect them to say, right? They didn't say anything surprising, but I think I do believe that because this exists within a regulatory framework, Jake. I mean, this isn't, this doesn't just get made by the companies and then potentially start getting dosed in people, for outside of a trial. The FDA is really the organization that has to vet that data, make sure that it actually proves that it is safe, that it's effective. That's going to be the real challenge in some ways. So the idea that the FDA has to be completely independent, not at all succumbing to any kind of political pressure, I think is the absolute key, even more so than the pharma execs. And, I have no reason to believe that Stephen Hahn, who I talk to regularly, won't be that guy, won't make sure this is totally vetted out.
All right, let's hope you're right. Dr. Sanjay Gupta, thank you so much. As always, coming up next, congressional Republicans are negotiating a major stimulus bill, but so far they haven't gotten President Trump on board. What are the sticking points? That's next.
A year like no other means an election like no other. The 2020 conventions are coming. The Democrats, the Republicans.
Digs into some other issues involving these alleged tapes between Biden and the former president of Ukraine, Poroshenko. Once again, the hand of Russia is seen by some intelligence officials.
Fiona Hill, a witness in the impeachment trial into Donald Trump, said this. Some of you on this committee I think it was the House Intel Committee, appear to believe that Russia and its security services did not conduct a campaign against our country and that perhaps somehow, for some reason, Ukraine did. This is a fictional narrative that has been perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services themselves. It would seem that her analysis as a Russia expert has either informed or been co-signed by the Democrats that worry that this stream of disinformation has infected this committee. What are their remedies? I mean, Chris Wray seems to be the embodiment of keeping one's head down and as far as we know, trying to do one's job without drawing the president's attention or ire. What access to any information or briefings do Democrats really have?
I'm so glad you brought up the Fiona Hill testimony because that really crystallized this issue about how Russia uses these different disinformation campaigns to deflect from what they did in 2016. And a lot of intelligence officials believe the sort of Burisma accusations that are being revived are once again trying to obscure what Russia is up to. And I think part of the reason the Democrats have put this letter out, even without a lot of details, is that the only remedy that really works is the resilience of a population.